Hi guys, welcome to lesson 2B. The subject of this particular lesson is, of course, evidence. And obviously evidence is a pretty important thing because as we talk about consistently throughout this rhetoric class, evidence is how you're going to prove your point. And it might come in the case of those rhetorical appeals from something less than logic or different than logic, we'll say, but it's still going to have to be something that could persuade people in some way. And so this is obviously kind of a big topic for us to address in this case. And it's something that's going to come back to again and again and again and again and again. But it's also important for the fact that you need to know what your options are. And sort of ask yourself the question, okay, am I tapping all of the different types of evidence that are applicable to this particular situation? And so that's what we're getting into as we talk about evidence in this particular lesson today, guys. So without any further ado, let's dive into this. As you can see, we start off here with claims are defended with evidence. All right, that's one of those situations where you might just say, duh, whatever. But I have to set up all the good stuff that's coming there after it. So evidence is your support for a claim or argument, whatever you're going to use to back it up in some way, shape, or form. An array of evidence, triggering logos, pathos, and ethos. Notice it doesn't say or, it says and, is typically recommended to fully argue a claim. So that's one of those things you want to get in the habit of thinking of. There is no one type of evidence that you should be using. You should be using all of the types of evidence that are going to help to convince your audience of whatever it is that you're trying to convince them of. So with that in mind, we get into some of the specifics about what are the different options when we're talking about evidence. So we start with something hopefully that you're familiar with already, if not from English class, then probably from like a history class or something along those lines. Evidence is either first-hand or second-hand based on its source and type. So as you may recall from your history class, first-hand evidence is something the writer knows from personal experience or observation or general knowledge of events. So they, in a lot of cases, they physically experienced it. You know, it's the difference between I can read a book that is about the Titanic. That wouldn't necessarily be by someone who actually lived through the disaster of the Titanic. If I got a book that was written by a survivor of the Titanic, well, that's their personal experience. It's their personal observations of what happened in that instance. So that's first-hand evidence, okay? And then, of course, second-hand evidence would be just the opposite, okay? Evidence that is accessed through research, reading, and investigation. In a lot of cases, particularly in the English field, if you're a college professor, you're getting evidence from other resources, not necessarily always undertaking individual scientific experiments yourself. Like I said, that's more along from an English perspective than other things there. It includes the factual and historical information. It will include expert opinion. It will include things like quantitative data, all of which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But it isn't necessarily something that you witnessed and experienced firsthand. It's something that somebody else did. Now, what this doesn't say, which, you know, hopefully you can sort of parse this out yourself, we do generally like first-hand evidence a little bit more than second-hand evidence. Now, sometimes there are things that can only be acquired via second-hand evidence. For example, you're not going to find a lot of documentarians making movies about their experience back during the Crusades. Okay, why? Well, they haven't lived quite that long. Okay, so there is obviously this understanding that second-hand evidence is an essential component of things. But there's always this little bell that goes off when first-hand evidence is used that says, you know what, this person lived this. This person experienced this. So we want to give it a little bit more credibility than we would have if it were just regurgitated in someone else's book, okay? So we have several different types of evidence that are at our disposal. And like I said, we want to be using a combination of all of these all the time. So we start off with analogies, evidence that makes comparisons between two unrelated things as a way to clarify one of them. And we've already talked about analogies as figurative language. Now, obviously, we're talking about it as a source of evidence. So if you're trying to explain how something works or what something is, sometimes the best type of evidence is just to say, well, it does the same thing as this other thing, except it does that instead of that. You know, I know I'm speaking in vagueness here, but that's how analogies kind of work. It's a way of comparing two things, and in the process of comparing two things, you're going to inevitably have a tendency to offer up some kind of incentive for people to believe whatever it is that you're trying to convince them of. So keep in mind that when you're talking about analogies, as it says here, similarities are going to be more important than the differences. In this case, we kind of overlook the differences to some degree. But it also means that we as the reader need to really understand both sides of the analogy. We need to understand what it is that you're talking about, because if there's this breakdown and this disconnect between what the one point of comparison in the analogy is, well, now it's no longer making sense to us, the reader. So you're going to really have to make sure that when you are choosing analogies, you choose things that most people, if not all people, specifically all of your audience, are going to be able to understand. But as it says down here, that's something you want to keep in mind. It can't act as standalone support. If the only kind of evidence you have in a persuasive argument is an analogy, you're going to lose. It's just as simple as that. Because you're making this comparison, and a comparison is never going to be that smoking gun that really gets the reader, the spectator, across the line into complete and total belief. Okay? Anecdotes are our second one here. Evidence drawn from stories about other people that the writer has either observed, been told about, or researched. So I usually think of these as kind of like short stories, okay? But they're short stories from people who, by their very existence or their profession or their experience, they have a bit more ethos embedded within them, their own personality than the average person. So it's a short story that might be communicated in order to prove your point. Now, as a short story, as this is, something that somebody observed, it does have a tendency to be highly subjective. And just like with analogy before it, it can't act as standalone support. How can you have something that's so highly subjective act as standalone support? Because that just gives people all the more reason to disagree with you. So you need to be leaning into these other things as well, and not just, hanging your hat on solely something like analogies and anecdotes, okay? We come down to current events. Okay, I'm sure you know what current events are. Things that are happening locally, nationally, and globally. The thing to keep in mind about this, as we say in that second sentence that's highlighted right now, is just that. They can be interpreted in many ways and may contain bias. I mean, case in point, just look at any given point in time in American life nowadays, how a historical event is interpreted by the one political party as opposed to the other political party. So it's all well and good to use current events as a type of evidence whenever you're writing anything persuasive, but you also need to keep in mind that you want to interpret it in a way that's A, convincing for your audience, but also isn't going to alienate them from you, because the interpretation of current events is highly biased. As it says here, that interpretation is subjective. There are multiple perspectives on every single instance that happens in current events. And so you need to think about bias very seriously before you commit to anything on that topic, okay? And then just mentions here that, of course, understanding the background of events is often very important evidence. So if you're talking about one thing, and it's important for us to understand the maybe less than current, maybe recent past events, well, that's an important component of this. And it might have a tendency to be slightly less susceptible to bias if it already is something that's essential for understanding where you're going to jump off of next, okay? So that kind of basic background is oftentimes the most reliable current event information that we can include, and hopefully it isn't something that will be too discolored by anything remotely like bias, okay? Now, on the subject of bias, this is an opinion-based writing assignment we're hypothetically thinking about in this case. So expert opinion is certainly something that you want to use. Knowledge of experts whose jobs and or experiences give them specialized, credible knowledge. That's one of your best sources of information right there. And specifically because that word expert means that they've got the ethos embedded within their job title or within their educational experience or something along those lines that says, hey, we're going to give this a little bit more credibility. Everyone in the world might have an opinion on this topic, but this person's an expert on this topic, so we're going to give them a little bit more credibility. So you definitely want to incorporate expert opinion, especially when you know that your audience is going to be receptive to expert opinion. There are certain, audience groups and topics where people will say, well, I don't care what the expert thinks. And there you have, almost a complete rejection of logos in that situation, and you need to sort of maneuver around that to find other ways to convince them of what you're trying to convince them of. Experts are often deemed such for having been published in scholarly sources and possessing advanced degrees. That's one of those things you want to be on the lookout for, particularly as we get into synthesis units in the future. Now that, this is an AP class, and as you're going to presumably a lot of you be pursuing college next year, the big question when you're finding resources is always going to be, okay, what makes this person an expert? And you're going to need to start really looking for those letters after somebody's name, and like PhD or something along those lines. And that's going to determine that, this person is an expert. Okay. Of course, that's getting an advanced degree isn't the only way to become an expert, but it is one of the fastest and most obvious ways of demonstrating that. Okay. Of course, it also mentions being published there, which sort of goes hand in hand with being a college professor as well. Okay. This is the backbone of an evidence-based argument. And, that's why I was trying to really beseech you guys to take it seriously a couple of moments ago. Expert opinion is the backbone. So this is what you're largely going to be going for whenever you're in any kind of synthesis situation, any kind of argumentation situation, okay? We also would just go ahead and assume that it's got the utmost credibility in your writing, okay? More than those analogies, more than those anecdotes, we're going to assume that the expert opinion, we can trust that more than all that other stuff, okay? Of course, there's historical information, which, is to some degree very similar to what we talked about before with current events. It's just shifted backwards in time a little bit. And as I said, background is often an essential component of evidence that people should be including within their writing. So these are verifiable facts that a writer knows from research. If you're trying to find background and context for the issues that you're presenting, also is a great way of developing that ethos, letting people know that I may be talking on this topic right here, but I can show you how this topic evolved over time. And as a consequence of that, I have the ethos to speak credibly on this particular topic, okay? So you might use this to demonstrate a point of comparison or contrast to some current situation. If you want to talk about how a past war is very different from present war, okay, well that makes sense. I don't know what your thesis would be in that case, but you might have to pull up that kind of comparison by bringing up the historical information, okay? You just need to also keep in mind this. Complicated historical events aren't always subject to universal consensus. It's kind of like that notion of, history is written by the victors, okay? A case in point of that in particular, the debate over whether Confederate memorials should exist or whatnot. There are very different viewpoints on the Civil War, even up to today. And there are a lot of things that we can agree on, but there are a lot of things that other people can disagree on at the same time. So when you're talking about stuff that's historical, you need to keep in mind, okay, not all history is universally accepted, okay? Then we come down to personal evidence, which is a little bit more of a grab bag of a couple different things. Certainly, expert opinion is a type of personal evidence, but the personal evidence is leaning a little bit away from that whole expert concept. So we're talking specifically about you in a lot of cases. So if it's personal experience, we'd say evidence that's from your own writing experience. Now, keep in mind, a lot of writing that you'll do academically, professionally, shouldn't have any first person in it, but certainly some can. And even if you can't use the first person, that doesn't mean there aren't opportunities to also pull in your experience. Talking about things very objectively without incorporating those first person pronouns, okay? Same goes with personal observations. This is stuff that you have seen, but not necessarily experienced. So again, they're kind of the same thing, but there are ways for you to sort of bring your own personal life into the text, whatever it may happen to be, and say, okay, this is true because it was witnessed by me. Again, if you're avoiding first person, you'd have to omit that part. And therefore, my thesis must be true, okay? Testimony, an expression of how the writer or someone the writer is citing feels about that. So just any kind of quote or passage that communicates what someone thinks or feels or believes. This is something that with the school newspaper we do a great deal because one of the things I tell the students always is you need to get quotes, lots of quotes. Even if it's about a war that's happening on the other side of the world, let's get some quotes from people around here. Testimonies of things that, opinions people have, experiences people have, if anyone would happen to have an experience on that topic, and so forth. And all of those things, again, add a human element to the abstract. So if it's an idea that's really hard for people to wrap their minds around, well, this is a chance for them to wrap their minds around it because they can hear and see what individual people are trying to communicate. People also are the source of most pathos. Okay, pathos is emotions, and emotions come from living, breathing human beings. So it's important to note that if you're trying to generate pathos, bringing up specific people and specific experiences is often a great way to go about it. It is, however, going to work best in introductions and conclusions. In the same way, it's not standalone support, just like analogies and anecdotes. So it's something that you're going to have to make sure that you're using either sparingly or very intelligently, not relying on it completely and fully, okay? And then, of course, we come down to, by no means any less significant, but qualitative evidence. Evidence supported by reason, tradition, or precedent. And you'll notice there's not a lot of information I give you on that, because tradition doesn't necessarily mean fact. There are a lot of traditions in the world. It's a tradition to think that to our east, the Jersey Devil haunts the pine moors of New Jersey. That doesn't necessarily mean it's true. So, yes, that isn't something that we necessarily need to talk about. Reason is just something that should be coming naturally from all of these other types of evidence. And precedent's a good thing. Precedent meaning it has happened before, and so that suggests it will happen again. So that's good stuff in that case. But there's not too much else to say on either of those topics, okay? And then finally, our last category is quantitative evidence. And this is one that I find particularly persuasive, and you probably do as well, especially as, academics in an AP classroom and whatnot. It is just the stuff that can be measured, cited, counted, and otherwise represented in numbers. So, like it says here, statistics, surveys, polls, experiment results, census information, all of that stuff is quantitative evidence. And frankly, I view that as being just as important as expert opinion because, numbers are very persuasive. And if, the numbers check out proving a particular argument, then it kind of becomes less and less likely to be refuted, okay? Remember, though, that when you're presenting that quantitative evidence, you're, of course, welcome to present it verbally and just say it, but you're welcome to use illustrations, graphs, charts, or tables. We are going to be looking at illustrations, graphs, charts, and tables during the course of this class. That also means that you are welcome to present information in illustrations, graphs, charts, or tables. So don't think just because this is an English classroom that prizes writing that you can't use one of those more visual medium. You absolutely can, okay? This, of course, does really rely heavily on logos, as you can imagine. However, the thing to keep in mind is the most shocking statistics can certainly appeal to pathos. I like the fact that comes to my mind about that is sort of the statistics about cancer and smoking. Okay, when you can get some of those statistics on smoking, it's kind of so shocking about how bad it is for you and how much it hinders people's health that it's almost impossible not to simulate emotions. So it's primarily logos, but the more shocking it is, the more pathos it can generate. Of course, the big thing is you need to verify all of your quantitative evidence. People need to believe that those numbers are accurate, because if they don't believe those numbers are accurate, then it's not going to be influential at all. So this is when you would start to maybe get into the situation where you start to present to your reader, well, how did we get this number? And how do we know that this number is accurate? And what were the scientific steps we used to come up with this particular percentage? And so on and so forth. So some audiences might not care about that, but some audiences will definitely say, okay, hold on, where did these numbers come from? Because I'm not buying it until you give me evidence to back it up, okay? And of course, just make sure that it's presented in a context and not manipulated with an intent to mislead. That would obviously be a big flaw in one's argument and set you up for complete failure, both as a rhetorician, but also as any kind of expert in a field that's trying to communicate a thesis of some sort. Okay, you want to make sure that whatever those numbers are there to represent, whatever they actually do represent, is what you're communicating them as having represented. So that's that, okay? So those are your different options when we're talking about evidence. And like I said, you should never be leaning entirely on one. You should be getting a hodgepodge of a couple of them at any given point in time. and really asking yourself, with a thesis like this, which of these types of evidence are the most important? With an audience like this, which of these types of evidence is really the most important? Okay, so that's that. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to bring them to class with you the next time I see you, and go convince somebody of something, will you please?